For decades, Intel was not chasing the future. It was inside it. Inside the computer on your desk, inside the office, inside the server room, inside the machine that taught the modern world how to work, calculate, build, trade, communicate, and dream. Intel did not just make chips, it became the hidden architecture of the computer age. And for a long time, that looked like destiny. Every new personal computer seemed to confirm it. Every corporate upgrade cycle seemed to repeat it. Every faster processor seemed to prove the same truth. The future would keep arriving through the same gate. And Intel stood at that gate. But then something changed. The future stopped looking like a faster personal computer. It stopped waiting for the next central processor. It moved into data centers, into artificial intelligence, into graphics processors, into parallel computation, into massive machines built not around one brain doing one thing faster, but around thousands of specialized cores working together at impossible scale. And suddenly, the empire that had powered the digital world for decades found itself facing a terrifying question. What happens when the future no longer needs the logic that made you powerful? This is not a story about a dead company. Intel is still alive, still massive, still important, still fighting to return to the center of the next technological age. And that is what makes this story more dangerous, because the deepest crisis for an empire is not always collapse. Sometimes it is the moment when the empire realizes that the world it was built to dominate has already started becoming someone else's world. This is the story of Intel, the company that helped define the computer age, the empire that made silicon feel inevitable, the champion of the central processor, the symbol of personal computing power, and the company that entered the artificial intelligence era carrying one dangerous belief, that dominance in one age could become destiny in the next. But empires do not usually fall because they forget how to win. They fall because they keep winning the wrong war. Intel did not begin this story as a weak empire. It began as one of the most powerful industrial forces in modern technology. For millions of people, Intel was invisible. You did not open your computer and look at the processor. You did not think about instruction sets or fabrication plants. You pressed the power button, the screen came alive, the machine worked, and somewhere inside that ordinary moment, Intel was present. That was the genius of the empire. It did not need to be seen, it only needed to be trusted. Intel became part of the hidden infrastructure of daily life, inside homes, offices, schools, banks, and government systems. And that kind of power is different from fame. A famous company is recognized. A powerful infrastructure company is assumed. It becomes part of the background, part of the ritual, part of the machine. Intel's strength was not only that it sold chips, it helped define what a computer was supposed to be. At the center of the machine stood the central processor, the CPU, the brain. For the personal computer age, this made perfect sense. The world was becoming computerized one desk at a time, and Intel stood at the center of that rhythm. The empire did not control the entire computer, but it controlled something more important, the belief that the most important intelligence of the machine lived in the processor at its center. That belief became a structure, then a market, then a culture, then a world. The phrase Intel Inside was not just advertising, it was a psychological contract. It told the buyer that the machine had a trusted heart. It told corporations that the device belonged to a serious standard. And guarantees are powerful things. They reduce fear, they simplify decisions, they create habit, they make the customer stop asking whether the foundation is still the right foundation. At its peak in the early 2000s, Intel held roughly 80% of the global PC processor market. Its Intel Inside campaign, launched in 1991, became one of the most recognized co-branding programs in the history of consumer technology. It helped turn the processor into the emotional core of the personal computer itself. Intel did not only design chips, it built the places where chips became real, Factories so precise that dust was an enemy, clean rooms where human presence had to be controlled, machines that carved intelligence into silicon at dimensions beyond ordinary imagination. This gave Intel an almost imperial aura. The empire was not only in the product, it was in the capacity to produce the product, to make it reliably at scale again and again. That was the old world, and in that world, Intel did not look like one company among many. It looked like the center of gravity, but every empire has a danger hidden inside its own greatness. The stronger the system becomes, the harder it is to imagine a world that does not need it in the same way. And the more perfectly Intel served the personal computer age, the more difficult it became to see the moment when the age itself would begin to move. The danger was not that Intel's logic failed, the danger was that it worked too well. That is the part most people miss. Great companies are not usually trapped by stupidity. They are trapped by success that keeps making sense. Intel's logic was one of the most successful industrial logics in the history of technology. Make the processor better, make it faster, make it more reliable, make it compatible with the systems customers already use. Keep the ecosystem stable, keep the manufacturing edge, keep the upgrade cycle alive, and as long as the world kept asking for more personal computing power, that logic was not only rational, it was dominant. The x86 architecture became more than a technical foundation, it became a kind of empire language. Its software was written around it, businesses standardized around it, developers understood it, customers trusted it, manufacturers built around it. And once an industry standard becomes deep enough, it starts to feel natural, not chosen, natural. That is when power becomes dangerous, because a standard does not merely win by being better, it wins by making alternatives feel inconvenient. It creates gravity. The more people build around it, the more everyone else has reason to keep building around it. Intel had another advantage that made the empire feel even stronger. It was not only a designer, it was a manufacturer, an integrated device manufacturer. In the semiconductor world, that mattered deeply. A chip design is an idea, a fabricated chip is industrial reality. And Intel's culture was built around the idea that real power came from controlling both. Design the architecture, build the factories, master the process, control the schedule, push the physics, deliver the future on silicon. This model gave Intel a kind of confidence that was not easy for outsiders to understand. It was not just corporate arrogance, it was earned confidence, the kind that comes from decades of solving problems that most companies could not even approach. That earned confidence also produced its most costly blind spot. In 2006, Apple's Steve Jobs asked Intel to supply the chip for a new device, the original iPhone. Intel's leadership concluded that the expected volume would be too small and the price Apple wanted to pay was too low. Intel passed. Years later, Paul Otellini would admit that the world would have been a lot different if Intel had done it. Apple went on to build the most valuable device ecosystem in the world without Intel at its center. This is why empires often move slowly at the exact moment they need to move fastest. Change does not arrive wearing a sign that says, "The old world is over." At first, change looks like a side market, a niche, a toy, a specialty, a distraction, a thing for gamers, a thing for researchers, a thing for cloud companies, a thing outside the center. And for a company built to rule the center, the edge can look small, but the future does not always attack the fortress directly. Sometimes it moves the battlefield. It changes the meaning of power. It makes the old center less central. And by the time the empire understands that the map has changed, it may still be strong, but it is strong in the wrong geography. That was the deeper risk. Intel did not lose its knowledge overnight. It did not lose its engineers. It did not lose its factories. What it began to lose was something more subtle. The assumption that the world would keep organizing itself around the kind of computing Intel understood best. That assumption had made Intel untouchable. And then it became the trap. The pivot point came when the future stopped looking like a faster version of the past. For Intel, the old world had a clear rhythm, a new generation of processors, a new wave of personal computers, A new performance story, a new upgrade cycle. The machine became faster, the user became more productive, the ecosystem stayed familiar, the empire remained at the center. But artificial intelligence did not fit neatly into that rhythm. AI did not simply ask for a faster personal computer, it asked for a different kind of computation. Not one instruction stream moving through one central brain, but enormous mathematical workloads distributed across many parallel units. Not the old image of the computer as a single intelligent center, but the new image of computation as a vast coordinated swarm. The old question had been, how fast is the processor? The new question became, how much parallel work can the system perform at scale? That sounds technical, but underneath it was a shift in power. The central processor was still important, but it was no longer the only symbol of computing strength. The signal moment came in 2012, not inside a boardroom, but inside an academic competition. A research team at the University of Toronto trained a neural network called AlexNet on 2 consumer NVIDIA graphics cards. It shattered the previous record in image recognition. AlexNet's error rate was nearly 11 percentage points lower than its closest rival. Researchers around the world took notice. The GPU had become an engine for intelligence, and the age of parallel AI computation had publicly begun. Intel's psychological trap was not that it ignored technology. Intel had scientists, engineers, researchers, products, plans, roadmaps. The trap was deeper. It was the belief that the new world would eventually have to return to Intel's language, that the central processor would remain the ultimate foundation, that general-purpose computing would absorb the new demand, that the empire's old center would remain the final center. This is what dominance does to the mind of an organization. It turns a successful model into a filter. The company does not ask, what if the world is becoming different? It asks, how does this new thing fit into the world we already understand? That is a very human question and a very dangerous one, because sometimes the new thing does not fit. Sometimes it is not an extension, sometimes it is not a side market, sometimes it is not waiting to be absorbed, sometimes it is the beginning of a new order. In Intel's story, this was not a single dramatic meeting, not one door closing, not one executive saying the wrong sentence. The pivot point was cultural, architectural, strategic. It was the slow moment when the company that had mastered one definition of computing power struggled to accept that another definition was taking shape. And because Intel was still so strong, the danger was harder to feel. Weak companies are forced to notice reality. Dominant companies can negotiate with it. They can delay, they can explain, they can point to revenue, to customers, to legacy strength, to technical depth, to the fact that they are still necessary. And all of that may be true. That is what makes the trap so powerful. Intel was not irrelevant. It was not dead. It was not a failed startup. It was a giant. But giants have a special weakness. They can confuse their weight with momentum. They can confuse their importance with inevitability. They can confuse being needed today with being central tomorrow. That is dominance mistaken for destiny. And once an empire makes that mistake, it does not immediately fall. It continues operating, it continues selling, it continues hiring, it continues investing, it continues announcing plans. But beneath the surface, the future begins building its own infrastructure, its own heroes, its own language, its own center of gravity. And one day, the empire looks up and realizes the next age did not wait for permission. Then, artificial intelligence changed the battlefield. And the most important chip was no longer the one the old computer age had trained the world to worship. This is where NVIDIA enters the story, simply as a competitor, not simply as a company whose stock rose, but as the symbol of a new computing order. For years, graphics processors had lived in a different mental category. They made images, they powered games, they handled visual work. They were important, but they were not the sacred center of the machine. Then the nature of the workload changed. AI needed parallel computation, huge matrices, training runs, inference, data moving through vast systems. The world needed machines that could process enormous amounts of mathematical work at the same time. And suddenly, the graphics processor was no longer just a graphics processor. It became an engine of the artificial intelligence age. But the deeper shift was not only hardware, it was ecosystem. NVIDIA did not win the new age only by making powerful chips. It built a software world around them. CUDA had been launched years before the AI boom reached mainstream scale. And by the time AI demand exploded, there was already a growing world of developer tools, libraries, frameworks, research habits, and technical knowledge built around NVIDIA hardware. That investment became a moat. Researchers knew the tools, startups hired the engineers, cloud companies bought the systems, AI frameworks were optimized around the platform, and switching away was not just a hardware decision. It meant rewriting habits, software, infrastructure, and years of accumulated trust. This is what old empires often underestimate. They think the battle is about the object, the ship, the chip, the device, the processor. But the real battle is often about the system that forms around the object. Tools, developers, standards, training, infrastructure, compatibility, trust, momentum, gravity. Intel understood this kind of gravity in the personal computer age. That is why its own story had been so powerful. But in the AI age, a new gravity formed around accelerated computing, around graphics processors, around data centers, around software ecosystems designed for parallel workloads, around the cloud, around the companies building the machines that would train and run intelligence at scale. The future had not simply chosen a different chip, it had chosen a different architecture of power. And this is why the story is not just Intel versus NVIDIA. That would be too small. The real story is old computing logic versus new computing logic. The old world was built around the personal computer. The new world was built around the data center. The old world measured progress through the central processor. The new world measured progress through accelerated systems. The old world sold power one machine at a time. The new world concentrated power in massive computing infrastructure. The old world was about the computer in front of the user. The new world was about the invisible machine behind the intelligence. This was the new map. Cloud companies became strategic gatekeepers. Data centers became the new industrial plants. Electricity, cooling, networking, memory, software, and specialized chips became part of the same battlefield. And Intel had to fight in this new world while still carrying the weight of the old one. That is not easy. Old strengths do not disappear. They become obligations. Factories must be filled, roadmaps must be defended, customers must be served, legacy businesses must be protected, shareholders must be convinced, engineers must be redirected. A company built for one empire cannot simply wake up and become another empire by declaration. It has to change its muscles, its reflexes, its culture, its speed, its assumptions. This is why comeback stories are so difficult. The world sees the announcement, the market sees the roadmap, but inside the empire, transformation is slower. A factory does not become a new strategy overnight. A culture does not become urgent because a slide says urgency. A lost ecosystem does not return because the empire wants it back. The market made the shift visible. Intel's old authority was no longer enough to define the next age. NVIDIA became the symbol of AI acceleration. Data centers became the new battlefield. And the center of computing power moved toward systems Intel did not fully control. And yet Intel's story is not finished. That is the crucial point. It still has assets that matter: engineering depth, manufacturing ambition, a national strategic role, relationships, products, talent, scale, the possibility of return. But the company is no longer fighting the same war it once dominated. It is fighting for relevance in a world where the center of computing power has moved. And when the center moves, every empire must answer one question: do we defend the old throne? Or do we learn how to build power in the new kingdom? This had happened before. Not in Silicon Valley, not in a clean room, not inside a data center, but at sea. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire ruled through ships. Its navy was not just a military force. It was the skeleton of empire. The sea lanes held the world together. Trade moved through them. Colonies depended on them. Power traveled across them. And Britain had built its identity around naval supremacy. To rule the waves was not a slogan, it was a strategic reality. The empire believed in ships because ships had made the empire possible. Then came HMS Dreadnought. a new kind of battleship, faster, heavier, built around a new logic of naval power. Its design helped define the age of the all-big gun battleship. And the shock was not only that Dreadnought was powerful. The shock was that it changed the measuring system. Older battleships did not merely become slightly weaker. They became part of an older category. The arrival of the new ship changed what counted as naval strength. That is the terrifying thing about technological transitions. A new technology does not always add one more weapon to the old world. Sometimes it resets the world. It turns yesterday's advantage into yesterday's architecture. And that creates a paradox. Britain created the Dreadnought. Britain launched the ship. Britain understood naval power better than anyone. But by changing the standard, it also changed the race. Suddenly everyone had a new target. Germany could build toward the new standard. Old British advantages were not erased completely, but the meaning of advantage had changed. The empire remained powerful, but the game had been reset. That is why the Dreadnought Mirror matters for Intel. Intel was not a minor player watching technology from the outside. Like Britain, it stood at the center of an old system of power. Like Britain, it had deep competence. Like Britain, it had infrastructure, prestige, and a history of victory. But when a new form of power emerged, the old measure of dominance no longer meant the same thing. For Britain, the question became, what is naval supremacy after Dreadnought? For Intel, the question became, what is computing supremacy after artificial intelligence? A faster old ship was not enough. A faster old processor was not the whole answer. The structure of the war had changed. The empire could still build, still fight, still matter. But it could no longer assume that yesterday's definition of strength would decide tomorrow's conflict. That is the brutal lesson of the Dreadnought moment. The most dangerous invention is not always the one your enemy creates. Sometimes it is the new standard that reveals your old advantage was less permanent than it seemed. The world does not ask empires whether they are ready. It changes the rules. Then it watches who can move and who keeps polishing the weapons of the last age. This is why Intel's story feels larger than one company. It is not only a semiconductor story, it is an empire story. The same pattern appears again and again. A system wins. The system becomes dominant. The dominant logic becomes culture. The culture becomes identity. And then the world changes. At that moment, the empire faces a choice. It can treat the new age as an extension of the old one, or it can admit something painful. The thing that made it great may no longer be the thing that makes it central. That admission is difficult for any organization. It is even harder for an empire, because empires do not only protect markets, they protect meaning, they protect the story they tell about themselves. And for Intel, the story had been clear for decades. We are inside the future. But in the AI age, the question became darker. What if the future is now being built outside us? The lesson is not that Intel failed. That would be too simple and too cheap. Intel is still here, still building, still investing, still trying to regain its position in the next era of computing. The company may yet write another chapter. That is why this story matters, because the most important empire stories are not always about collapse. Sometimes they are about the moment when a living empire discovers that survival is not the same as leadership. A company can still be large and lose the center. It can still be profitable and lose the narrative. It can still be necessary and lose the future's imagination. That is the danger of dominance mistaken for destiny. When an empire wins for long enough, its success becomes evidence. Then evidence becomes belief. Then belief becomes doctrine, and doctrine is harder to change than strategy. Strategy can be revised. Doctrine feels sacred. Intel's doctrine was born from real greatness. The central processor mattered, the personal computer mattered, the architecture mattered, the factories mattered, the trust mattered. None of that was imaginary, but the future is not loyal to the thing that built the past. The future is loyal to the system that solves its next problem. And in the AI age, the next problem was not simply personal computing. It was scale, parallelism, data, acceleration, energy, infrastructure, software gravity, a new kind of machine. This is what every empire fears, not that it will become weak overnight, but that the world will discover a new definition of strength. That is the real pivot point. Not the moment when the old empire disappears, the moment when the old empire realizes that the throne it protected is no longer the center of the room. Napoleon learned that victory could become a trap. Boeing learned that trust can collapse when the wrong voice becomes final. BlackBerry learned that the perfect machine can be built for the wrong war, and Intel shows us another version of the same pattern. The empire that powered one future can still miss the moment when the future changes shape. That does not make Intel foolish, it makes Intel human, and that is why the story is worth telling. Because every empire, every company, every leader, and every person faces this question eventually. Are you still building the future? Or are you defending the logic that once made you powerful? The answer is never obvious at the beginning. At the beginning, the old logic still works. The old customers still buy. The old machine still runs. The old metrics still look real. The old victories still feel like proof. But somewhere, quietly, the new world starts building itself. Not always in the place you are watching. Not always with the tools you respect. Not always in the language your empire speaks. And by the time everyone agrees that the future has changed, the center may already be gone. That is the tragedy of Intel's story. And the warning, because empires do not only fall when they lose, sometimes they begin to lose at the exact moment they believe they have already won. Thank you for watching The Pivot Point HQ. If you want more deep documentary stories about the decisions, illusions, and turning points that change modern empires, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next empire.